Welcome back, guys, to the Beyond Condition podcast, where today we're going to be talking about finding your why. So this is definitely something that comes up a lot in the area of physique development. But of course, this relates to things across the whole of your life. It's really, really important to have that correlation with your goals as to why you're trying to achieve them, how you're going to feel by achieving them, and also planning ahead. There's so many things that you can commit to that are either short term or long term, but then it's trying to think about what actually comes next after that. And if we're relating this back to competing, there's a lot of people out there at the moment that are going to be in that post-show period. And sometimes when you prep for a show or you take part in a diet, after that, there's a lack of planning as to what's next. And you can often feel in quite a dark, confused place because you've completed a goal, you've seen through a diet or a prep. And then off the back of that, it's where do I go now? What is my motivation to continue, whether that's to go into a growth phase or you've changed your mind in regards to how far you want to take your diet. So there's a lot of things to consider when looking at developing your physique. This is also something I talk to people a lot. I talk to clients a lot about this, and it's something that I've been considering a lot myself of late. With competing, I've been bodybuilding now for around 10 years, and I've done back-to-back shows pretty much for 9 years. I've completed 7 preps, and doing that back-to-back with off seasons in between, but the longest being 10 months, there was times where I could grow as an athlete in regards to in an off season, but actually this time around, I'm taking next year out and having much longer in this gaining phase to facilitate muscle growth, but also a difference in my life now, being happy and wanting to facilitate making memories, really focusing on my online coaching. I can then use this phase to focus on other things rather than going back to stage next year for an 8th time, which is crazy when I say about it, because I know there'd be listeners hearing this that do the same. You know, you compete back to back and not much thought goes into it. You go for a prep, you go into an off season, and you keep doing that. And you're so motivated by the stage where you can take your physique, doing a prep or a diet. You really do feel motivated to see where you can take your physique, how you're going to look each time you complete a prep or a diet. And it really does, hit you deep. You feel super, super pumped to see what's going to happen this time around if you've done this multiple times. But sometimes I think it's good to take a step back, and if you have competed several times in a row, to think about why you're actually doing it. And are you relating that back to your previous stage performance? Are you looking at the feedback objectively? Are you working with a coach? Are you looking at potentially having a longer off season to facilitate muscle growth if you've had that feedback? Or are you just wanting to compete year in, year out and, maybe not thinking about this objectively or as objectively as you could? It's very easy to get into this loop. And I myself, I've spoken about this on the pod before. For me, competing and getting into bodybuilding right back at the start, and for most of my time as a bodybuilder until last year, it was to funnel a lot of unhappiness into something that felt positive. It was a way of blocking that out for giving me purpose. And again, back to bodybuilding and being able to do this year on, year out, you can get lost in that time warp of how would you see a year without competing? How would you see a year without going to the stage? Depending on what your motivations are. And this is a sport that does offer that purpose. It offers you tunnel vision and focus, and potentially you can be, well, I guess hiding from certain things in your own personal life by funneling your energies into this sport. Again, something that feels very positive. And it's not until coming into a place in my life where I am much happier that I'm actually able to dig a little bit deeper and really focusing on what my why is. Now, right back at the start and on reflection, coupled with being unhappy and having something to focus on, actually, when I look back and when I first got into bodybuilding, the control it gave me and the likelihood of being something that I could be good at through my own effort, this was something that massively motivated me. This was another part to my why to compete. I actually really like being different and being away from the norm. And something that I don't think a lot of competitors maybe know is that actually we're in a very, very small percentage of people that would do a prep and actually get to stage, be able to withstand a diet of up to potentially 8-9 months, depending on whether you're doing, back-to-back shows, whether you need to have a long diet to facilitate being ahead of time rather than running out of time. It's a large portion of your life, and it gives you that almost feeling of I'm doing something that other people aren't doing. And of course, a lot of people relate when you do a prep, when you're dieting hard, especially getting to the tail end of a prep. A lot of people will say, I never thought I could do something like that. People will say to you that won't ever do it, I wish I could do that. And it's another little motivation to feel like I'm doing something that other people only could ever wish of doing. And particularly when you do your first prep, when you get to the leaner conditions, it's a very cathartic process, I find. You are looking at yourself daily. Sometimes you're changing daily or weekly. You're seeing your physique respond, change, and you get to a point that you maybe never thought was possible for yourself. And that becomes addictive in itself. And the hyper focus that you get from a prep, because most of us will have a date in mind or a show in mind, it facilitates this focus because you've committed to a date or a show. And of course, a lot of us wouldn't want to back out of that. However, a lot of people do, because things happen in a prep. Something comes up and people don't continue a prep. And it's those people, actually, Delif and I mentioned on the pod we did, that actually you don't hear about those people that potentially don't complete a prep for whatever reason that is. So again, you're part of a small percentage of people that get to stage. And that can, of course, feed this desire to continue doing that. So on reflection, definitely that had a part to play in a motivation for me, especially right by the start. And I think I probably got caught up in that, wanting to continue disciplining myself, doing things that other people, well, I guess, weren't able to do or would wish for. Even though you can say that if you wish for something, you can do it, but it's not always achievable for people. Everyone has different commitments. Everyone has a lot of things that they need to think about in order to commit to a prep. And for me, I was lucky enough to facilitate being able to continue prepping. Another big factor for me, and this is a big thing, those of you that know me will know that my mum and I are very close. I always wanted to make her proud. Going back to the being able to be good at something through your own effort, this really does ring true to me, because in life, sometimes you're gifted with certain talents. If you're into sport or some sort of academic skill or anything that you're able to facilitate as a talent at a young age, you can then continue that throughout your life. And if you want to become an expert at that. And there was nothing really that I had that connection with. I wasn't into sports, grades and everything were okay, possible, but there was never anything that was a standout for me. I never felt a passion for anything. And then to be able to find bodybuilding and make my mum proud, be able to almost give back to her working hard to be a single mum and bring me up and raise me, that really did give me another added motivation. And actually, something that I think is quite relevant is when I won my first show in 2019, I remember thinking, if I was to ever win a show, because I'd already done 3 seasons previous to this, and the highest placement I got was 6th place. So to win a show was like, would this ever happen? Would this be achievable for me? And I went into this season thinking, if I don't place higher than 6th, or, if I don't get potentially a top 3 placing. Is this the sport for me? Is this something I can be good at? I did feel like it would be. And I always thought winning a show would give me that inner peace. It would give me that, I guess I've made it in life. I've done well enough. I've succeeded. And I thought that this feeling would make me feel complete. I honestly thought that that would be enough to, on reflection, take away the sadness that I had in my life, because all I wanted was to win a show. The reason behind winning a show was never actually, I want to be a winner. And it wasn't from, I don't feel, an ego point of view. It was more to be able to get recognition for what I'd put into doing 3 preps, this being my 4th. And I wanted to lift a trophy, and I wanted to make my mum proud. And when I won my first show, I looked in the audience and saw my mum, saw her face, and that was massive for me. I was able to do something to make her proud, and I know that she's proud anyway, but I felt like this was something completely different. It was away from the norm. I could win a show through something, a talent that I'd manifested and worked hard for myself. It wasn't something that, came from childhood or came from anywhere else. It was something that I'd found and that I'd put energy into. And that reward on that day was winning a show. The next day when I woke up and after a show, you're pretty knackered. It's a weird feeling. Thoughts and feelings are there to be processed. You don't always know what those thoughts and feelings will be. And I remember going for a couple of hours on a walk, replying to messages, doing an Instagram post. I was in a, whole new world. It was an amazing feeling. But I remember the undercurrent of thinking, oh, I'm the same person. I feel the same. I was happy that I'd won the show, but I was the same Sarah. I was the same person. And I didn't have this completeness that I thought would come from winning a show. And I'll always remember that, because that then highlighted to me my why was making my mum proud, was doing something that was away from the norm, but it also highlighted that I was covering up the unhappiness. And it was quite hard to process and digest those feelings, because I wasn't at a stage where I was ready to come away from the unhappiness, being in a marriage that I wasn't completely brought into. I wasn't happy. So consequently, I did back-to-back shows that year. It was a very good year success-wise in competing. But then the next year I competed, and then we're into 2022 and I competed again. And now, being happy, I'm at that point where I'm processing what is my why, because I've achieved being away from the norm, as it were. I'm known as a bodybuilder from most people that I speak with, which I love. I love being a bodybuilder. It's something I'm so passionate about, but it's also something that I'm really passionate about when I want to help people realize what they can do through bodybuilding to evolve themselves physically and mentally. And that passion for helping others is on that tipping point where that's actually something that I feel much more passionate about right now, to be able to facilitate people doing what I have, to be able to recognize what they are able to do. And being able to create memories is super, super important for me right now. That wasn't something that I had before. I just wanted to train. I just wanted to track my food and be neurotic with it, because I was able to focus on that rather than deal with other things. So it's a really interesting space to be in, and it does excite me, but it also makes it very relevant to how people can find it quite hard to find your why. It's a different kettle of fish for everyone. It's a very broad spectrum, and there's lots of things to consider when you're finding your why. There's no reason why your why can't be something like, I want to diet and get to a certain weight or get to a certain size clothing, if that motivates you enough. If you can hang a t-shirt up on your wardrobe that you don't currently fit into, and you want to fit into that and feel comfortable in it, why can't that be enough to be your why and be your motivator? However, if you're competing, your ambition is to step on stage. Again, that's a very good, strong why. Setting a date in mind, being able to really focusing on getting stage ready is a very, very good goal to have. It's then considering what comes off the back of that. So whether it's the t-shirt analogy, when you get there, what happens then? Do you maintain? Do you strive for a smaller size, a different look in that t-shirt when you compete? Where do you go from there? Do you go into an off season to improve? Do you allow long enough to be able to improve to then compete again whenever that's going to be? And something that's very relevant to competing, like I mentioned at the start, is gaining judges' feedback. Now, when I competed back to back, the first couple of seasons was that I needed more muscle, and I was able to facilitate a 10-month off season, which is, like I say, the longest I've done. And it was that 10-month off season that took me from a placing of 6th to a placing of 1st, and 10 months of pushing up much quicker than I would have, and being able to push up into I say with inverted commas, an uncomfortable position in an off season. When I dieted back down, there was a remarkable difference. And that's also very, very relevant in regards to what your motivation is to be able to advance as a competitor. If you're looking to take on judges' feedback and your aim is to gain more muscle from that feedback, then especially as natural competitors, you will need a longer period of time to do that, and a structure in place, a plan in place to facilitate maximal muscle growth. So there's a lot of interesting things to think about. Of course, if you compete and your feedback is to work on something like your posing, but your condition and your muscle mass for your category is there, then you may not need as long in an off season, but your focus in the off season would be to continue posing, would be to use a posing coach, hopefully, and it would be to bring the same condition with the muscle that you have, and potentially gain a little bit more in the off season phase that you can allow. With the off season phase as well, off the back of a show, it's always important to remember there should be a recovery phase in this period, because when you prep and the hormonal adaptations, everything that goes into a prep, you need that space to recover. And it's not until potentially I find 6 to 8 weeks after a show that I start to think, actually, I feel a bit more like Sarah. I feel like I've got energy on day-to-day life. I feel like I'm able to commit more to things within a day that you maybe wouldn't have done, especially at the tail end of a prep. And something very interesting for anyone listening that is a natural athlete that I saw the other day on Instagram was George, who comes on the pod. He did a post about natural competitors doing shows and, well, competing back to back every year. There's a lot of health implications potentially in later life as well that should be considered in regards to losing your period, the hormonal changes that occur. And this is something that he's put in some literature out there about, and it's definitely worth considering this, again, if you are a natural competitor. Back to finding your why and trying to nail that down to ensure that you're on course and that you're actually directing your energies towards something that's going to give you that fulfillment that you're on track. Now, physique development in itself, I found another undercurrent of my why is to improve my physique year on year. And that's why I delved into there about, competing back to back, taking on judges' feedback. If you can look at your stage shots and you can improve each time you compete, that in itself may be enough for you if that motivates you to continue as an athlete. And that certainly is something that I love to look back on, even checking photos from each prep and then the stage shots when you get to show day. It's a very, very cathartic thing to be able to look and notice improvements. Again, this comes with structure and being able to commit to building phases if your goal is to gain more muscle, or if you've got the feedback to gain more muscle. And there's a lot that goes into it. It's not something that you can just do. I believe that it's something that requires a plan and structure in place. So this could be another great reason for you to continue your journey as a bodybuilder, especially if this may have been your first season. In order to compete again and look back, it would be great for you to see, wow, I do look better, whether that's from more condition, whether that's from more muscle. There's also competitors that push up to the next category, like Rimini, who I've mentioned on the pod before. And she's done a much longer off season than if she was going to stay in bikini. And hats off to her, because she's really, really working super hard to move up to figure. And it's really great to see, because I remember when we met, and then I judged her at a show and gave the feedback, if you want to move up to figure, you need a longer off season to facilitate that. So it's great to see. But that's a really good example of someone that's why is to move up the category. And that's been enough to motivate her to have a longer off season, to be able to really focus on building muscle, and then to come back as a figure athlete. And of course, if that's what you're looking at, there's then the adaptation of changing your posing, looking at different routines, and understanding that category a lot more. This also feeds into another thing to consider when competing, because if you are looking to compete and you want to be successful, do your research, let it motivate you, understand what the category is looking for, look at the federations you want to compete for. And also, like we've mentioned on the pod before, take yourself to some shows, sit there with a notepad, look at how people hold themselves, stage present, look at what the judges award, and start to understand what bodybuilding shows are like, how they're structured. And it's a really good, it's almost like a little exhibition day, because you're going there like a student to understand what the federation and the judges are looking for. This also is a really great tool if you are having a longer off season, whether you're moving category or not, is to do your research, go to shows, be present on the bodybuilding scene, mix with other athletes, get to know people in the industry. And then when you come back to prep again and go back to stage, you've got this inner understanding that you may not have had if you're not exposing yourself to going to bodybuilding shows, understanding how things are judged, how things run. It's quite a shell shock to then go to stage and suddenly it's show day and you've never been in that environment before. Now, if we strip it right back when we talk about finding your why, it's definitely, there's definitely a process you can start to think about here. And this is really good when I work with clients, even when I've looked at this myself, to just get a baseline of trying to find your why and what that's going to bring you. So initially, what your goal might be right now. So what do I want to achieve? Now, if we use the example of going to stage, I want to compete. So if that's your overriding goal, how will that feel when you arrive at that destination? How will that feel when you compete, when you get to stage? The accomplishment that's going to come from that. And what you can do is jot this down, brainstorm even. This doesn't have to just be a thought process. This can be something that you actually put pen to paper and actually start to put this down into writing. How will that feel when you get to stage? How will that feel when you've completed a prep and done something, like I say, that a very small percentage of the population will ever achieve? Write down how that will feel, how you think that will feel. And also, how when you write this down, when you make it a thought, when it comes out loud, what does that feel like emotionally? Does that give you an overwhelming sense of achievement? Do you feel passionate about that? Is it something that's going to really, really resonate with you and almost become quite a cathartic process if you get to that stage? Because prep is hard. Yes, you can do it. A lot of people can do it, but it is hard, especially now. There's a lot of competitors. There's a lot of people wanting to compete. And of course, that means that there's going to be a lot more people that you will be competing against. So this ups the ante on being able to bring the condition that the judges want to see, bring the appropriate level of muscle mass that the judges want to see. And of course, there's a lot more that goes into competing than sometimes you first realize. There's your stage presence, your posing, there's hair and makeup for bikini athletes that actually is a fairly large percentage of your score. And if you're anything like me, before bodybuilding, when I first saw that bodybuilding show that I've mentioned before, I thought, that's not me. There's no way I can be pretty and move elegantly and do what these girls were doing on stage. But this becomes a skill. You learn, you get coaching, you get help from people around you. This leads into something else to consider when you're brainstorming and trying to work out what your why is. Do you need help to get there? And are you in a position to be able to take that help, to gain that help? And by that, there's several things to consider. There's a cost implicated with competing. There's a cost with a coach, bikini, posing coach, potentially the food if it's going to be different to what you're having now, a gym membership. There's a lot of things that maybe we overlook when we get into bodybuilding that actually I've known a lot of people that haven't been able to do a show because financially they got there and they couldn't facilitate it. And they'd done almost a whole prep and actually had to pull out from the show because when racking up what that would cost, including travel, including accommodation, the show itself, depending on your federation, there's a lot of things that go into the financial costs to competing as well. So when you write down what your goal is and how you're going to get there, be realistic with, do you need help and are you in a position to facilitate that help? It then goes into looking at what you have coming up. And this is something that is really, really important. Do you have commitments coming up that would potentially get in the way of a diet or a prep? Have you looked at the calendar ahead? If we go on the proviso that a prep's going to be around 6 months, what's coming up in that next 6 months? And this is something I work with clients to do because there's different ends of the season as well. You've got the start of the season starting around March, and then that goes through. Sometimes there's a bit of a gap in the middle around the summertime, and then you've got the end of the season. And that's something that I always work with clients that want to compete, is that if you're looking to go in and try and qualify for the finals are going to be at the end of the year. So we're looking at potentially October, November time for most federations. And if you qualify early on in the year, say in a show in March or April, that's a long time to be thinking about then getting ready for the finals. And I've done this myself. It was actually quite a cool experience. But since then, I've always competed later in the year in order to, if I qualify for the finals, I continue the prep for a much shorter period of time and then compete at the finals, rather than you've also got start of the year, you've got periods like Christmas. And that's something that can be quite hard to prep through. It's not unachievable, but it does take a lot of willpower, a lot of focus. It's naturally for most people a family time. There's different foods around, there's different occasions, and that is something to consider. All of us have the ability to be able to negate these things, and of course having a coach to be able to help you with that is an important factor here. But are you willing to do that? Are you willing to prep over Christmas? Or would you prefer to have Christmas, have the start of the year, and prep a little bit later on into the new year, say February or March, and then go for a later show and potentially have that view of qualifying for the finals as an option? If you do qualify, you then bounce into the finals. So there's definitely things to think about. Look at your calendar, look at what's coming up, plan around it. Because once you're in a prep, if you are really, really looking to if this goal is to get to stage and have minimal distractions, then this is going to be a massive tool to your box. Of course, in life, things come up, life isn't linear, a bit like weight loss. Nothing's ever smooth sailing. Well, I mean, you do get periods of time that are smooth sailing. I shouldn't say that, but things come up. That's life. You never really know what's going to happen day to day. So, of course, if you're in a prep and something happens, if there's a trauma that happens, if there's a disaster that comes up, you may well need to postpone that prep. But also know that that's okay. And having that date in mind, having that why, if that does have to change, this is where also it's something to consider when you have your why. If your why is to compete on a certain date, and for some reason something comes up that's going to derail that, and potentially you may not be able to compete that year, it may need to be put off to the following year. You also need to arm yourself with tools to be able to process that, to be able to get through that. Because, of course, this goal of competing, being so hyper focused, if something happens that needs your attention and you need to come away from the prep, if you're dealing with something that's a big thing that's happening in your life, to then deal with the feelings of feeling like you're having to give up and then you're not able to get to your goal, this is a very, very tricky space to be in. So by having this in the back of your mind that this is your date, but competing's always going to be there, that's just an undercurrent to think about with this journey. It's something that I always think is relevant. Of course, you don't need to spend every day of your prep thinking, what if something comes up, I'm going to have to quit? That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is it's something to always remember that the stage is always going to be there for you. And if that is your goal and it does get put off for whatever reason, you can still go back to it when you're ready to. And this leads into being in a position to commit. Now, be realistic with yourself. Look at your lifestyle, look at your commitments. This can go into a brainstorm as well. Is your daily life going to be able to be set up so that you can do everything that goes into a prep? Now, at the start of a prep or even a diet, it can be fairly minimal, the impact on your life, because of course you're allowing time. So at the start, it might be a little bit easier to be able to maintain a diet with a busy lifestyle alongside that. And of course, there is ways to negate being able to prep and have a busy life, but you need to be realistic with if this is going to be achievable and whether starting this prep is the right time, and are you in the right position and the right situation to be able to do that. If there's overarching things that are very impactful in your life that require a lot of attention, but you want to prep and you think, no, I can do this, I can do it all, you can very quickly overload yourself. And I've done it myself. I've had trauma going on at the same time as a prep, and actually it gave me the focus that I needed to not allow myself to, I guess, go into a hole with what was going on. And that was a death in the family. And actually it gave me an opportunity to be able to focus on something else to get through that grieving process. But not everyone is like that. So you need to make sure that mentally you are honest with yourself. Are you ready to commit to this? And if you're not honest with yourself and you commit to it and then fail or have to pull out of the prep, how will you feel when that happens? So like I say, diarising, looking at your calendar, being realistic. And also, if you have got something coming up, if it's something that potentially, say it's a weekend away at a family member's house, you can work with your coach to be able to negate that. It's more, are you going to be comfortable and are you going to have that commitment to your goal to be able to stick to your diet, to be able to factor in training or move training around that weekend to facilitate doing all of the sessions that are required. And also, like I say, at the start of a diet, it may be that little bit easier to factor these things in because potentially your cardio is not going to be as high as it would be at the tail end of a prep. Potentially you've got a bit more time and you're doing less posing at the start, and that ramps up as you go over your prep. But this is definitely something where a coach comes into play. Being able to talk to your coach about this, being able to plan. There's so many things that you can get from having a coach, the benefits that you can get from having that support, from an outsider going, okay, so what is it that we've got coming up. It might even be a week's holiday. I've been on holiday prepping. It is achievable, but what is required is focus and planning. So this is something you can work with your coach to achieve. So being realistic with this, being, well, planning ahead, being organized, this will bring in that sense of control, being able to go into a committed prep. And there's a really, really big factor here as well in regards to being open and honest with the people around you, with your support network. There is situations where if you have a partner or friends that don't quite understand this journey and what's required, it could be that your other half books a holiday and they want it to be a nice surprise because they've seen you in prep and it's something that comes out of the blue. This, I know from personal experience and working with clients, it can really, really cause a problem in regards to you feeling like you don't want to go away. It wasn't planned. And this is where sometimes planning ahead, but not knowing those unplanned events can cause that distress, can cause you to feel under pressure, which is, of course, we don't want stress in a prep. Well, ideally minimal stress and things that we can do something about. You know, if you're stressed because work's busy, you can put things in place to bring that stress down. Whereas unplanned events, surprises that potentially, if people don't know what's required, would try and do to make you feel good, to show you they love you, can actually cause you more stress than the happiness that it could potentially bring. So by being open and honest with the people around you is really, really key, because your why being completing a stage prep is super and super important to you. But if people don't know that around you, if people don't understand what it takes, then these things can come up and it can actually make it harder. And this can then become quite an isolating sport if potentially you could have been a bit more open and honest and actually said, this is my why, this is what I want to achieve, this is why I want to achieve it, I'm going to feel X, Y, and Z by getting there, and make it almost a non-negotiable that this is what you're going to do. Make it important, come across clear, come across decisive. This will help you to commit that little bit more. Now, when you're looking at goal setting, there's a really easy framework that I use a lot of the time, and it's called SMART goals. You may have heard of it. It's a really easy way to just map out your goals. Again, you can brainstorm, you can write this down. The first part is being specific. So this ties into a date. This ties into making it a specific goal. So getting to stage, fitting into a size 12 dress, being able to run 10K, being able to complete a triathlon. All of these things are specific goals, and that's very important. If you can get this down as your why, as your goal, this really does help to have a strong structure in place for what your goal is. And of course, being able to measure this is super important. So having small goals along the way, or, you know, working with a coach if it's in a prep to say, the prep's going to be, as that example, 6 months. Where do we want to be after the first 2 months? Where do we want to be after another month at that halfway point? What's required to get there? Putting these things in place to measure whether you are on track towards that goal, towards that endpoint. And it's super, super important to make sure these goals are attainable, are achievable. And this feeds back into, are you being realistic with what you want to achieve? And this is where R comes in: relevant, realistic. Are you setting a goal to get to stage, but you've got 3 holidays that are all inclusive coming up, and you've got 2 weddings to attend? Is that achievable for you? Or would it be better to do those social occasions, those commitments, and start your prep after? Are you a shift worker that has really, really hectic shifts, and actually you find that your physique, when you've tried dieting before, doing these night shifts really does have a massive impact on your sleep patterns, on your food patterns, and actually doing a prep with this work pattern is going to be very, very difficult. Do you need to be more objective in regards to what you can achieve? There's lots of things to consider. And again, that's not me saying that when you are a shift worker that you can't achieve these things, but there is things to think about with a prep. The lack of energy that you will gain, the pure amount of things that go into a prep, your steps, your training, your food prep, eating itself, trying to get good sleep. Like I say, especially at the tail end, sleep and recovery is very, very important. And sleep becomes much more difficult anyway. And if you have shift work, or, you have a small child, lots of things to consider of how you would negate that if you were going to go into a prep. Now, then we want to consider time. Now, it's something I've already touched on. Have you set the right amount of time to achieve your goal? Do you think, right, I'm going to do a bodybuilding prep, I'm going to do a 12-week diet, I've never done it before, let's go, set the date, 12 weeks, I'm in? Or do you allow longer, which is something we always promote on the pod? Because actually, if you were ready early, as it were, which is not that common, but if you were ready early, you could potentially hit a bit of a maintenance block, bring food up a little bit. You could potentially play around with training, and actually it might be that you can then diet a little bit close to the show again, go into your carb up, be much fresher for show. So actually allowing longer, there's not really any negatives to that, because you can facilitate. If you were ready and you responded really well, you could actually bring in a little bit more food, maybe look at that training changing, and be fresher when you get to stage. So there's a massive positive there. Like I say, it's not something that is massively common. People do short preps, and it's much more common now for people to do the shorter preps. I've seen it a lot more this year. There's another thing to be said for that as well. You don't know the full extent of that person's prep, their genetic makeup, their individual response. So I would always promote allowing longer rather than shorter when it comes to timeframes. And it's something to tie into being realistic, being measurable, being specific for you. And going back to the goal setting idea, do you have goals along the way that can facilitate a shorter term goal, a medium term goal, and then that longer term goal? If we were going with the example of 6-month prep, is there things like being able to build a posing routine, being able to do your posing and do your routine flawlessly? If you're just coming into this sport, is there a point where this could be something that you want to get to a point of confidence where you feel you can hold your own on a stage? Is there a goal in mind in regards to where your body composition needs to be? And this is much more relevant to working with a coach, because of course they have what they're looking for in regards to your physique response, and that can be something you can talk to your coach about. Weight goals are a bit of a grey area when it comes to physique development, prepping, dieting, and it's not something I really get too hung up on, because especially being your first time in a prep, it would be very hard to say you're going to compete at this body weight. If you've done it multiple times, I myself know each time I've competed what body weight I am, and I like to use that as data and something as a sort of target in mind in regards to where I would head to get condition. This year was very different, and I actually got 8 kilograms lighter than I was on my previous prep, and it was 5 kilograms lighter than my season of winning the shows when I had a really good season in 2019. So that's a very good example of how actually weight is a number. It's not something that is easily marked down as a goal. So just bear that in mind when you're looking at goal setting. I've already touched on what would happen if you don't get to that goal and being armed with that. And that also feeds into trying to have things in place that if something comes up, you're able to move things around or amend things so that you can still facilitate doing the things that are required from a prep. It's really, really nice to be able to start facilitating by writing down, brainstorming, having these thought processes, how you'll feel when you get to that goal. Because something that I spoke about on the pod with John when we spoke about mindset is manifestation and visualization. And something that really worked for me is visualizing and feeling what it would feel like to win a show, how that would feel walking forward, taking the trophy, hearing the cheers, hearing your name. For me, looking in the audience and seeing my mum, how would that feel? And I manifested that. I visualized that. I felt that. I went to bed every night for countless nights, feeling what it would feel like. And that was a night and day difference into when I went back onto the stage and how I felt there. And this sort of work starts to almost help you believe that you can achieve it, because you're writing down, you're manifesting, you're thinking about it, you're putting thought into what you actually want to achieve from your goals from this sport, if it's in regards to bodybuilding. And it really does, it starts to feel like an internal drive that only you will feel. And back to where I mentioned improving your physique each time you compete, each time you diet. If that's your why, if that's your motivator, then being able to feel that you're putting all that effort in every single day when you're doing your training, when you're doing your food prep, all of these things that go into being a bodybuilder, all of these things that will motivate you to continue on your quest to feed into developing your physique. It then becomes a very solo journey in regards to what you get from this sport. And I definitely think myself, this for me is a very internal drive to be able to progress and improve my physique. That right now is enough to motivate me to continue into a gaining phase and to prioritize other things, like I said, like my coaching, creating memories, but still being able to do my training, do my food prep, do all of the things that go into being a bodybuilder, but not needing the stage to be there to motivate me. And in regards to motivation, it's something that I did a post about the other day. Motivation isn't always going to be there. When your alarm goes off at 4:30 in the morning, haven't slept very well, you got to go and do an hour on the Stairmaster. We've all been there. Well, some of us would have been there. It's hard when you've got to do this volume of training. You're on low energy, low sleep. There's got to be something more than the superficial motivation that we have. It can be, you might have motivation 80% of the time, but on those days where it's not there, on those days where you wake up and you think, I'm not feeling motivated, the skills that you learn from being a bodybuilder, adherence, resilience, but also a greater understanding into what your why is, then you don't rely on motivation all the time. And when you are motivated, when you have those good days, some days in prep, I'm like, I am super motivated to just go and get it. They're super cool because it's like an accelerated version of a day where the motivation isn't potentially there. And it's key, I think, I believe, from my own experience and working with people, that finding your why and feeling what that's going to give you, manifesting that, being there, being present with it, being present with your actions, that all of those daily wins that accumulate to you getting to the stage or reaching your goal, this will have a massive impact on your life and an impact on how you view your success. Because success from placing or winning a show, or, if you suddenly gain more followers on Instagram because you've won a show, you get an influx of people that are really, on board with, well done, congratulations. After a show, you have like this manic week or two where you're flooded with so much praise. It feels so good. But then this can die off. And I'm not saying that's for everyone, but, in my experience, it dies off. And then it's back to you, just you doing the daily do. And this is something I noticed as well on social media with off season. in a prep, there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of posts, you know, you've got so much to talk about. Everyone's engaging with you. Everyone shows interest in regards to, you know, you've dropped another kilo, you've seen another glute pop, all of these things that we strive for. You're looking more shredded, you've got more vascular, all of the things that look cool on the gram. And then a lot of people die off in off season and there's not much content. There's not as much there in regards to physique. And this is actually something that Rimini, who I mentioned earlier, is very good at, posting, you know, training videos, her push up, how that feels, what she's up to, what the goal is. And this relays back to how you can feel when you come off the back of a show and you go into a gaining phase. If you are going to commit to a longer phase, say you're going to do 18 months of a gaining phase, you're at stage condition, you're lean, you're the leanest you've ever been. And then all you can see is 18 months of potentially pushing up. And this is where the extremes of bodybuilding come into play. The extreme of getting lean, so you're shredded, and it's not, I mean, if we're honest, it's not a healthy position to be in. And you're trying to come out of that, you know, into that recovery phase, push your body weight up a certain amount, which again, you can work with your coach on, to then get to a point where you then continue to push up. And I've been there multiple times where you get that point where you feel uncomfortable. You know, you don't feel like your aesthetic is pleasing. You feel critical. And it's this either end of the spectrum that a lot of us will struggle with. It's tough, male and female, you know, committing to these different phases. Both of them bring uncomfortable periods. And it's planning ahead for that, you know. Sometimes the thought of an off season and doing it for a longer period of time is why people don't do it for a long period of time. And consequently, every year their physique looks very similar. So it's super, super important to, before you go into that off season phase, before even you compete and go into that phase, to talk with your coach, to plan, to think about, okay, so after my show, after my season's ended, what's the next step? Even if you start to talk about it, and ideally have a plan in place for what happens that week off the back of the show, what happens the second week, have some figures in mind. You know, if you work with figures, if it's something that appeals to you, and it can be quite a good thing to motivate us as the personalities we are with bodybuilding, having figures, having things to aim for, what body weight you may be looking at pushing up to initially in those first few weeks, how that's going to feel, talk through the processes, what sort of food you want to integrate, do you want to go for some meals out, all of these things. You can talk about them before the show. There's no reason why there has to be a dump of all of these things that you need to process and consider after the show, when the lead up to a show is mental anyway. The day after a show is mental. So to start having these thoughts beforehand and planning is a really, really cool thing to think about. And then looking at what your focuses will be off the back of that: training performance, restoring health, all of the things that are really important to us as bodybuilders. And I think it's very easy in a prep to become accustomed to feeling like shit, for training to be getting it done, rather than when you're in that growth phase or maintenance phase where you're really enjoying training, where you're connecting with training, where your intention is there, where you're getting pumps, all of these things that can be very good motivators in an off season. And I will bring it back to always, if you're a competitor, if your feedback is to gain muscle, to be able to be more competitive, it's going to be super important that that is the foundation to your why. But using the tools I've spoken about today, how will it feel if you come back to stage and you look completely different? You've responded to judges' feedback, you've gained muscle, and you're much more suited to the criteria, and consequently you're more competitive. How will that feel? Do you need help to get there? Can you commit and can you plan? These are super, super important things to think about if you're looking at going back into competition, and where that's going to head in regards to if you will compete back to back, or whether you will have a longer off season and go back to stage the following year, having the following season off. So it's definitely something to consider for those that have competed this year. And depending on what your feedback is, there's lots of things to think about here. You know, like I say, if your feedback is more stage presence to work on condition, it might be that you have a shorter off season and you allow longer for your prep. If conditions are focused, if the posings are focused, having shorter in your off season, but practicing your posing during that phase. Lots of avenues where we can correlate with the feedback that the judges give. And I will finish on, when I spoke about Instagram, it's a very positive place at times, but always try to remember that this is a highlight reel. And again, with things like pushing up in an off season, people say that they're pushing up, people say that they're comfortable with it, people say that, you know, I'm going to commit to a longer off season, but you don't know what these people are doing behind closed doors. Are they pushing up? Are they hitting the volume of food that they're saying they're hitting? Are they doing everything they can to be able to gain muscle and cheerleading it from an honest place? Because it's such a positive thing to be able to gain muscle, to commit to an off season, but it does take a lot. It's a different mental shift, it's a different mentality, and this ties into a lot of things on social media, in different communities. This really does need to be a solo endeavor in regards to, you're the one that's going to need to put work in here, you're the one that's going to need to be consistent, you're the one that's there when that 5 o'clock alarm goes off. So if you can relate back to finding your why, make this intrinsic, make this important to you, make this non-negotiable. This really will help you to succeed as you move forward as an athlete. I really do hope this episode has given you things to think about and tools to consider finding your why, but also what's going to help you progress as an athlete in regards to competing and being a successful bodybuilder. And success equates to what you see success as, and that is a super important message. Whatever your why is, whatever your goal is, if that's important to you, then you will be succeeding. I really do hope you've enjoyed this episode, guys, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. If you get a chance to share it on your stories or share this episode with anyone that you know that will find it useful, I'd be super grateful. Bye-bye for now.